Good morning. Sorry for my raspy voice. I want to give a big thank you to the team here at Travelers Rest who's been covering for me while I have not been feeling well. Really appreciate Jess, Savannah, Madeline, and Luke handling everything. Today's program is all about stewardship of the land. So let's begin by acknowledging the original stewards of this place. We are gathered today on the homeland of the Séliš people at a place they call Timsum Clee. Their example as the original stewards of this land guides our work today. We are committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through the ancient crossroads on this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations, and we invite you to learn from and support them as well. Many thanks to the supporters who make winter storytelling at Travelers Rest possible, the members of Travelers Rest Connection, Montana Public Radio, MCAT, Missoula's community resource, who are recording these programs for us, and Parkside Credit Union. I also wanted to take a minute today to say thank you to Shields and to the Bill and Rosemary Gallagher Foundation, who helped us mount the beautiful exhibition of McLean family illustrations on the walls around us here. For those of you on Zoom, if you haven't been to see the show yet, please come out. It's really beautiful. Also for the folks on Zoom, it's helpful if you keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation. But if you have questions for our speaker, please type them in the chat box. We will monitor the chat for questions and for any technical difficulties you might have. Now to welcome today's speaker. A very familiar face around here. Bruce Bugbee is a land conservation consultant and the founder of American Public Land Exchange. Throughout his career, Bruce has worked to conserve nearly 1 million acres of Montana land. In the 80s, Bruce trained Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to use conservation easements, work that is translated into FWP easements of about 500,000 permanently protected acres, mostly family farms and ranches that are also available to hunters and anglers today. Bruce also worked hard during the 2003 to 2006 bicentennial celebration of the Lewis and Clark expedition to conserve land across the state, including guiding the public acquisition of Travelers Rest State Park, for which we are always grateful. Yes, please. Bruce is the co-author of the award-winning book, Saving the Big Sky, which he'll tell us about today. Bruce Bugbee.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the wonderful introduction there. My immediate reaction is the idea that I did all that. Let me assure you that this is a multi-person, multi-organizational accomplishment that continues. And for the most part, it is entirely independent of anything I do. What marks the beginning of this presentation, this book, 50 years ago, a little more than that. But in 1975, the Montana legislature passed an enabling act for conservation easements. And it took a year or so to get things going. And I'll tell a little bit of that story. But before I get launched in that, if I could get some idea from you of, are you all local? Are you visiting? Okay. Yep, good. Where? Pennsylvania. Oh, good. Yeah. Ian McHarg is one of my all-time heroes. He taught at the university there, landscape architecture. But that also speaks well of Travelers Rest. You're participating ongoing. I hope you're going to many of these presentations, and there's a lot of good people that have important information to convey and share with you. Let me I was just thinking, Nancy's already warning me not to get going in details here and move right along. I do have a tendency to sort of get on a roll and go talking about all sorts of details, and before I know it, an hour is up and everybody's asleep. So I'm going to try to avoid that today, do my darndest. But let me talk a little bit about the book. The names up there that you see, there were there are three of us that were authors. We all were at the University of Montana at the same time. Jack Wright and I shared a graduate student office in geography, and I happened to be in environmental studies, as did Bob Kiesling. So we were all sharing that time and classes and so on. Interesting stories for each of them. The topic, though, saving the big sky, what makes us aware of this place and the idea of conserving it, our sense of place. How, in the simplest way, it is mostly visual. It, in my experience, it's what we see every day, what we relate to, tell ourselves where we are. It reminds us of experiences that we have in this place, and those experiences shape who we are. So this book is an act of reciprocity. The three of us feel we've been given deeply in this place and other places, and this is our way of giving back. We struggled with that. It took us 4 years to write this. I promise not to take more than a year here. But that sense of place, you see towards the bottom there, named Kevin League. Kevin is a professional photographer, and we have, I think, 90-some photographs of his in the book. We thought about putting all the photographs together in one chapter, because that would be about the sense of place and how we experience it. We also discovered that his background in fish, wildlife, and parks is that he was involved in the lands division where the department acquired conservation easements, and he would go out and field check them and take photographs. And so he already had a wonderful group of photographs for us to work with. And he has a professional studio in Helena, by the way. And he also works with the Prickly Pear Land Trust. So fully familiar. We also have contributions in here from Shane Doyle, who's a Crow man and teaches at Montana State University. And he tells a story of how the people who had been here 13,000 years or so in this region, how they were impacted by the changes brought on in this sort of manifest destiny going across North America. An important story, and if we pay attention to that too, that also tells us about the sense of place that evolved over thousands of years in this place. And there's much to be learned from that. And I find that every time I kind of make a connection there, that's a wonderful insight and carries me forward, and I appreciate it. And I thank the many tribes that were part of this country, in particular Séliš and Kootenai, Kalispel. And my pronunciation, I'm sorry, is not anywhere close to the authentic. But I've started on this book, which you've got in the bookstore here, and this is a marvelous book. Including how to pronounce the Séliš, and with apologies, I haven't quite gotten there yet. We have a chapter in here too that is put together and authored by the Séliš and Kootenai tribe. That's a very important part of this too. Again, we learned a lot because of the stories of this place that we're in, and how these experiences, this place, are valuable to them, and they have much to teach us. I thank them for that. So who am I forgetting here? Steve Running, local retired professor, one of the group that won the Nobel Prize in their research and on climate change. He is. That's something else that affects us all in many different ways. Well, I won't go there yet. But let me see, who am I not? Okay, Steve Running, conservation, climate change. Oh, the one thing I did want to say back to the Séliš and Kootenai, they have their own climate change policy that they developed and have adopted in their government starting about 20 years ago, a little more than that. And when I've discovered and enjoyed learning about, and in their chapter, you'll see how much they have taken on their, within their government and their people that have led their way in many respects that are exemplary for us to consider as well. So, my thanks to all of them. I think that both Bob and Jack are tuned in. They're somewhere down in the warmer parts of North America, returning at the end of April. But and I've suggested that if I really get off base, that they call in. And if necessary, take over. All right. Okay. So, let me make sure I'm doing this right. This is much easier to look at, I think. Oops. Okay.
Is that the right way?
Yep.
Okay.
Back one. Rocky Mountain Front. This is. There are so many parts of Montana, as you know, just spectacular that to experience. And this is one of our stories that we never get tired of experiencing, the Rocky Mountain Front. And then,
Next one?
yep. So at this point, I'm disconnected from this? Where?
Do you want to try to click it, see if it's going to go now?
Okay, let's see. Yes. Okay, good. There's hope. This is a map showing the extent and the historical occurrence of many of the tribes in Montana over the thousands of years, and more recently in particular with the displacement from east to west with the development that pushed them this way. It's one that takes some time to really understand, but just to give you an idea that of how people, the indigenous populations are still here in our experience, and I'll use the pointer here. This is going to, Nope. Other one. I'll use this pointer. This color, you'll see the reservations that in their current shape. One other thing I would say about the different tribes here is we have a tendency, we being those of us that come lately, to think of them all as one people, as indigenous people. Let me tell you, they do not think of themselves that way. The different tribes have they're very proud of their traditions, their knowledge, and how they are going forward. And they certainly communicate and share a lot, but there is a certain rivalry amongst them, and it's we discovered that. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Yes. So what is land conservation? Stewardship, sensible use of the land and ethics and ecology, sense of place, reciprocity, cultural values, literature. Public land, the way that we are used to, at least I am used to thinking about conservation, tends to be in a formal, do we have wilderness areas? Do we have national wildlife refuges? Do we have places like Travelers Rest? That these are formal acts that have typically been taken by our government representatives, and they tend to be focused on the spectacular. What is different here that I hope to get some idea of this across to you today is how private lands are conserved. And in our experience in Montana, and frankly across all of North America, particularly precipitated through land trusts, local voluntary organizations, Bitterroot Land Trust, Five Valley Land Trust, Montana Land Reliance. There are several of them in Montana. And over 50 years, it tells quite a story of how these places are conserved and how they relate to one another. I'll be going into that in a little more detail. But what is true for all of these transactions is that they do not happen without the individual landowner saying, okay, I'm ready to go ahead, I'm ready to sign, tell me where. And that's absolutely critical to understand that these are decisions made by individuals. And they're made by individuals for a variety of reasons. I'll go into those a little bit. What we found in our interviews with several of those that we've worked with over the years is that when you ask them about why it is they are still out there on those places, their whole countenance changes. You can see them smiling and about what their experience is and how they think about the places that they see in one day and out the next. It's very special, and I'm not sure they would all characterize their decisions in this way, but my observation of them is that these are acts of reciprocity, giving back of what's been given to them over the years. Okay, again, this is also a typical experience, what we see when we drive down the highway. And I want to point out a couple of things there. Let me see if I can do this yet. Nope. Okay. What is fairly consistent is that the homesteaders that came out here with the promise of 160 acres, 320. Well, first of all, there's no way on earth that you survive out here as a family or as an individual on only 160 acres. you have to have something, what we've discovered more recently over the last several decades, is that the ranch sizes that survive are typically 2,000 acres or more. And besides that, they're supported by another 4,000 acres of leased land, leased from Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, state lands, and so on. Okay, another little story here. We've done a lot of work with the American Prairie Reserve over the years in eastern Montana, and that their focus is on the National Wildlife Refuge on the Missouri and near Malta, northeast of Livingston, that sort of area of northeastern Montana that is big and open. In Phillips County, where Malta is, the population of that county in the early 1900s is more than twice of what it is now. And you find that as a pattern for the counties in eastern Montana, northeastern Montana. There are many exceptions to that, though, locally. But that is, that tells the story of how people have newly come to this place and kind of learned the hard way what it takes to survive. And in that process, you find the lands that they would homestead to be concentrated in the valley bottoms. It's where the water is. This is dry country. And that water is critical to surviving over time. And so the valley floors, more gently sloping, fed by streams that can be a source of water, and the storage system, which isn't working this winter particularly well, is the snow in the high elevations, and that it is released more slowly through the summer months. And so the mountain range in the background there was sort of obvious. That's not where I'm going to be plowing up a hayfield. And the mountains, fortunately, are rather dramatic in their altitudes in Montana. So that's also where public lands are in Montana, mostly Forest Service, and then to a certain extent, Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management was sort of the catch-all public domain. We don't think of it, certainly not now, but in its original construction of what became Bureau of Land Management lands, were the leftovers after the ranchers homesteaded. So the patterns of the private land follow the valley bottoms, the good soils, what can be farmed, and moving then up into the foothills is kind of a mixture. Grazing lands, forest lands begin in there, and then on up the gradient. But that's a pattern that's repeated. It's certainly repeated here in the Bitterroot Valley, valley floor, one of the early homesteaded areas, and the last home place of the Séliš people of this heritage here. I'm already up to slide number 5. So we've talked about what is land conservation and the private lands. Oops, am I going? Sorry. Oh, okay, here we go. Another important aspect is that we think about how we make decisions from day to day and what's presented to us on a daily basis to make decisions about with computers. Fine thing here. And marketing and national corporations, I mean, we get inundated with decisions that other people want us to make to get through the day. And so we tend to think of things in very fast, everyday sense. And for that reason, our book begins with a story of how this land was shaped over millennia and hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And in this case, the most recent big influence, the Ice Age. And you've all heard of Glacial Lake Missoula. That's one of my favorite experiences. It's formed and drained over 30 times. And the shorelines that you see on the hillsides, I like looking at those and beginning to think in terms of what was that like then? What would have been, what would have been my shoreline house, and have a boat and so on. But there is a way that I found to do that, and that is particularly in the winter with our temperature inversions that sock the valley floor into fog. Well, it happens to be about, it's not too hard to imagine what that looks like, what the lake must have looked like. And it was huge. The Flathead Lake is a big lake, and it was just a small portion of some 2,200 square miles of lake. And the idea of what it took when the ice dam in northern Idaho, when that popped loose, and then you had all that water draining out to the Pacific in the course of 3 or 4 days. 60-mile-an-hour blast of water going through, and we sometimes thought of that as a way to do urban renewal. If we really get serious about that. But one of the stories in here is this story of Coyote and how this area was named. And I'm sorry not to, Timsley? Timsley. Oh, thank you. The place of no salmon. Again, a geographic reference. You may well know that how the salmon populations are distributed across the whole Northwest. And the story of Coyote deciding he was going to bring the salmon over the mountains here. And, he selected a good one, put it in his pack, covered it with grass. But he was told by the salmon that they didn't want to come over here. And but the only way is if he made it all the way over the mountain without stopping. And this coyote, as he walked behind him, he would leave a stream. And so as he went up over the mountain, I love to think of that going over the pass up here, and that lovely stream that cascades through there. But the closer he got to the top, the salmon made himself heavier and heavier. And Coyote got near the top. That's an experience that I relate to too. And it was just so heavy that he had to stop and said, well, I'm almost there. So he stopped. The salmon immediately jumped into the stream that was behind and was gone. That was it, no further. And so the place over the mountain crest is a place of no salmon. And there are references too to the bull trout and that are lots of stories and much richness. Again, a good place to start with here. This is the challenge that we faced in our time. The subdivision development We have a chapter on subdivision development. It features the Bitterroot Valley. And many of you know the story of the apple orchards. Frank Lloyd Wright coming in and designing the first country club, golf course, and the idea of being a land developer was not invented recently. It's been around going back for the United States with all the homesteading. That was big development action. We have formed our ways of living, our towns, but that is a similar commitment going forward as a conservation easement. The conservation easement is the right for another entity, like the land trust, to say, no, you cannot develop. But it's all those terms are agreed to with the landowner of what's being given up there. The landowner still owns the land, still farms, ranches, but can't do things that the easement says you can't do. Public access, by the way, is only by virtue of agreement. Hunting access, that's not automatic. Fish, wildlife, and parks easements emphasize those because the funding for those easement purchases has come from hunting licenses and fishing licenses. So there's but this, and we're in the latest subdivision boom to coming with the end of COVID, I hope. The thing that's not talked about a lot is the whole profile of who are these people coming? Who are we? The old age population, the retirement population is enormous. And it's for the first time, it is much more extended than it has been historically. And there tends to be a certain amount of wealth with that. And we have many examples of how other people have looked around and said, oh, this looks like a nice place to live. I think I'd like to have a ranch up here, or whatever. That has led to the latest subdivision boom. And also a comment about what works and doesn't work with conservation easements. The conservation easements work best when thought through well ahead of those things. And to be aware of that and proactive. And I see Ramona sitting here, and I thank you for your proactivity with Bill and caring about this place and the legacy of this place and that speaks to us in so many ways. Thank you. Another brief comment about the differences of what conservation easements are and what they are not. The typical way that we're affected where we live by public concern is through the police power. That is to protect all of us from something that our neighbor might do or somebody visiting, coming in from the outside and affecting us in a way that we don't want. And zoning regulations, subdivision regulations, those are all examples of how those rights may be impacted. They are also not permanent. But when they result in development, there again is a permanence that affects us going forward. So the conservation easements arise from what landowner rights have, what they own in what's called fee simple absolute. All the rights that go to land below, on surface, above. So to engage in that conversation early, before there is tremendous pressure from the outside, is the time that we've been most successful in accomplishing easements. I'll get this right one of these days. Okay. Statewide map. The color areas are generally public lands and reservation lands. So you see the big white color, lack of color going to the east. That is the open plains for the most part. That's what was mostly homesteaded. And what is harder to see are the patterns of lands, again up in the northeast corner here. No, it's not going to work. This area up here you see tends to be more colored. That's also the extent of the continental ice sheet coming down. And on the edges of it, you can imagine what we find when we take a float on the Bitterroot or the Clark Fork. In those places where the current slows down, you have the finest sediments. And what are the finest sediments? Silt and clay. And for anybody who's tried going out here hunting or something, and you know what it's like if it rains when you're out there, you don't go anywhere. That clay is so heavy, and it'll build up in the wheel wells of the vehicle you're in, and you just literally stop. Well, the ranchers again, farmers said, that's probably not where I want to be, right in the middle of that. But they certainly like to lease the land for cattle grazing. Great. So some general guidance thinking about conservation. Large conserved areas work better than small ones. Fragmentation degrades landscape. Fragmentation, subdivision development, typically. Corridors create connectivity. That's another thing that we tend to overlook in thinking about Yellowstone Park and all the animals that are there. Well, where do they go in the winter? There isn't food to eat up there for the most part. There's still some animals that are able to stay up there, but they go downslope and they go into the valleys and they migrate for food. And so to the extent that we want to experience all these wonderful animals in Yellowstone Park, it kind of depends on their ability to survive the summertime. And there's a great book, in fact, it's one of the ideas that we got our book from, published by Oregon State University, which, thank you, Oregon State University Press. They have a focus on Yellowstone Park, and they show the migration routes that go out from the park into Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and they're very concerned, as are many people, concerned about conserving those routes, and that means no houses in those, if at all possible, or a low density. It typically also means that the river bottoms are avoided because that gives them cover to move out and then go grazing, of course, on the ranches overnight. Okay, we've talked about most of this, about what's the incentive, why bother with a conservation easement. Locally, we've seen a capacity of local finance, bond issues, in Missoula in particular for Jumbo, Sentinel, the river corridor that used to have a railroad going right down it, Milwaukee, and that now is a fantastic trail system. And the vegetation is somewhat restored, the riverbanks, and let me go on here. Okay, again, this is 50 years ago. This is what it looks like, about 4 or 5 years ago when we had to turn it in to the publisher. The purple is the pattern of private lands, particularly conservation easements. And it's fun to see how they're grouped. Missoula area, where we are right now, the Blackfoot, the Rocky Mountain front, big areas up in the northwest, the headwaters of the Yellowstone, of the Missouri River. So we've tried to tell the stories of what we found in each of those, what motivated, and so on. The summary, 3.5 million acres under conservation easement. That's probably closer to 4 million now. The 2.5 million acres purchased outright. So 10,000 miles, square miles of Montana voluntarily conserved. 10% of the conservation on private lands occurs in Montana. We have 0.03% of the population of the United States here. We've done well. Nearly the size of 3 Yellowstone parks, just a sense of scale. Where they're protected and why. Oh, another layer of this private land conservation that we have not talked about so far is the national organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Lands, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, which we've got locally here, their headquarters, the Conservation Fund, also they have a Northwest office and a Montana office. These are national organizations that have figured out how to raise money to provide as a incentive for people to make these kinds of choices. We have stories about these regions in the state: Blackfoot, Missoula, Flathead Indian Reservation, Rocky Mountain Front, Greater Yellowstone, Northwest Montana, Helena region, and the Prairie. This is just a quick view of how we experience those places that we described in 2 or 3 words. This is taken from the Line Ranch on South Hills, looking into the Rattlesnake. The Line Ranch, by the way, has a conservation easement on it. And this is the result of what the Greater Missoula area were right in here today, and the impact, and you begin to see that purple mass in the upper right-hand corner. That's in the Blackfoot Valley, and I'll talk a little more about that. This was what the rattlesnake was in 1970. And 1980, when the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area and wilderness was passed, that's what it was. And to the extent that the uplands were privately owned, these are railroad land grants. That was compensation for the privately owned railroads to construct the east-west lines of the railroads. And they were given alternating sections, 640 acres, a whack, out to 20 miles on either side of where they went. And they also eventually were given a choice. If there was nothing in there they wanted, they could go further out. Many of those patterns remain, but they've also opened the door to a certain kind of conservation solution. I'll comment on that in a minute. That's what it looks like now. In the 80s, we worked out a transaction with Montana Power Company. They were happy to do it, fully compensated, and all those miles of stream frontage, which were being subdivided and developed in the late 60s and 70s, stopped here. And with that momentum, there were a number of private landowners said, I want to be part of that. I will provide a buffer by saying no more houses on my land, or no more than 4 on 800 acres or something. So that 93% of the Rattlesnake Valley is conserved. Most of it is in fee ownership, outright owned by all of us. And then in the lower area, we get into conservation easements. Looking into the rattlesnake. And I realize I'm spending a bunch of time. I think that the way that conservation has happened locally here is a way that we have shared with many other places in Montana and done well with. So I'll go on from there. This is a place of the small bull trout going up Rattlesnake Creek. The large bull trout, by the way, is the Blackfoot. Rock Creek. I left this in here. It's already, most of it is already publicly owned. Conservation easements have occurred in many areas, particularly down towards the mouth. Five Valley Land Trust has been very active in there. They were in fact active before the Conservation Easement Authority was passed in Montana. I don't know if many of you know of Ellen Knight. She was hired by a organization that was formed back then, the Five Valleys not the Land Trust, the Five Valleys River Parks Association. And she started meeting with landowners talking about conservation easements, and then the authority came along to do that. The 9 Mile, another area, Upper 9 Mile, the first place that wolves were found outside of Glacier Park. Quite a story there. There's a book about there. Rick Bass done a nice job with that. And verification, that's really a wolf in the 9 Mile. The Blackfoot River watershed is particularly instructive. This is the river watershed boundary, the public lands that existed for the most part in 1970. And Norman McLean and the river runs through it. I got to say one little story about that. Do you know where the river runs through it was filmed, the movie? It was down on Paradise River. It wasn't in the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot didn't lend itself quite to the aesthetic that they wanted for the movie. Incidentally, there is the McLean Film Festival coming up in Missoula this summer. And if you think that we get long-winded here, we're going to be part of that, doing a presentation. But this quote here, in our family there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. Well, we know for all of you that are fly fishers and fishing of any kind, there's a certain spiritual connection that is developed, and a quiet and an appreciation and the excitement of some for more than others experiences of, a rise and you've got a fish on. The fly fishing has also had a major role in conservation of private lands in the valley bottoms. Some very creative and innovative land trust folks, particularly Montana Land Reliance was one of the first land trusts formed statewide in Montana. And they would take corporate executives on a float trip for fly fishing. And they're very good at sort of easing them into the great experience of fly fishing. And isn't this a beautiful countryside we're floating through? And wouldn't you like to see it stay that way? And you too could be part of this by supporting us. And some of them bought ranches and placed conservation easements. So there's quite a few substantial conservation easements in the headwaters of the Missouri River that have that history. There is another area in the Blackfoot that has that history, the fly fishing there. The upper Blackfoot, and looking at the backside of the Mission Mountains with the larch turning, and some of the folks and our relatives that have come back and grown there. the moose, trumpeter swans up there have been reestablished and are growing. And of course, elk, North Fork coming into the Blackfoot. Let me also just comment about this too. I can see where I'm going to wind up here in time. This is Lan Lindbergh and Hank Getz. The University of Montana has an experimental forest right in the middle of the Blackfoot. Hank Getz was the manager of that for many years, and he became good friends with one of the local landowners, Lan Lindbergh. And they worked through with many of their neighbors what they called the Blackfoot Challenge. And this again is a component of organization similar to what we all are doing right here, is where we share ideas, we think about what's possible, and then we think about how can we make happen what is possible. The Blackfoot, they also brought in timber companies, outfitters and guides, ranchers that would meet regularly, and but they had one rule, which I think is extremely important. It's important to us in our family. It's the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time we can agree. 20% of the time we can't. And let's not waste our time on the ones we can't. Let's do what we can do. And they were, time and again, they were able to encounter and successfully work their way through notions of what does it mean to have a timber harvest that sustains life, that doesn't leave it as a vast cut over scarified landscape, hard to have anything in the way of wildlife and beauty associated with it. I'm being a little bit overly carried away with my adverbs here, but the bottom line is they were able to have a dialogue amongst the different ways that people cared about the Blackfoot and find ways forward. You know, one of their big things, this was again subdivision time in the 70s, and the going up the Blackfoot River was a tempting idea. The ranchers were not that interested in that because the people who were already coming in were cutting fences and camping out on private land and disturbing livestock and complaining to the rancher that they would let the livestock go out there and poop everywhere. You know, and the counter move to that as a broad public was, well, let's have wild and scenic river status for the Blackfoot. Great idea. The ranchers mutinied on that. They said, not on our backyard. But they then were able to carry forward to find a solution through their Blackfoot Challenge that worked out a management relationship, the guidance of public use through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. In fact, an agreement still in effect, still happening and working. Blackfoot Challenge, some of the people involved. Okay, this is what it was in 1970. That's what they've done. Here again is this checkerboard. The Nature Conservancy entered a big deal with the timber company several years ago, and they've worked out and they continue to work out a reconveyance to the Forest Service. But mostly that's ranches that have been conserved with conservation easements. And the Blackfoot River itself is this thread through here. And you can see that a lot of the frontage there is under conservation easement. You may have noticed just in the last week, there's another 1,800 acres, I think it was, that went under conservation easement in the Blackfoot. This happens to be an old homestead up on the below the Mission Mountains, up in north of here. And the bison range. This is a map prepared by the Séliš and Kootenai that shows a number of conservation commitments that they've made within the reservation. And what was most known about, I think, was the bison range, the idea that the Fish and Wildlife Service were ahead of it. Why not keep it that way? So on, many different backgrounds here to consider. That's now tribal. And any of you go up there with some frequency and drive through, do the long route as well as the short route, and then go to the visitor center. The visitor center is a breath of fresh air. It's been redone by the tribes, and wonderful experience. And the roads through, one of the things that caught my eye going through there recently is when you get to the top of that long road and you've got the beautiful view, all 360, they've added a sign standing there that has all Séliš names of place names. And it's something, one of those, why don't I think of all the place names that I have in some way that ties me to a story of how they evolved, and that they don't have to be an absolute factual history, but something that I get to imagine that I can participate in. And so I relate to this place and I care about it. And that's a big lesson in terms of naming. And believe me, all through around here, it's part of what the Traveler's Rest has addressed, and the Bitterroot and so on has this capacity. The bison, great stories there. The animal crossing there, that took years to work out with the federal highway system and the state highway system, and a pretty good solution. In other parts, there are several parts where the passageway is underneath the highway, typically following creeks. And there's a lot of grizzlies up there too, it turns out. And the Mission Mountains, the Mission Mountain Wilderness up there is a tribal wilderness. I think it's the only one in the country so designated. There are tribal sacred areas. There are special management areas for bighorn sheep, for elk, and for the grizzlies. Rocky Mountain Front, another big demonstration area. The Blackfoot Reservation on the north end. This is Glacier Park up here, and then the Forest Service extends on down towards the gates of the mountains, that area. That's what it is now. The first conservation step here was by the state of Montana, concerned about elk winter range, and those elk were coming out of the high mountains there, and there were, I think, 2, maybe 3 state winter ranges established. They were not very big, but important. And so at the time this began, that's all there was. Bob Kiesling, one of our compatriots in this book, was head of the Nature Conservancy in Montana. He was the first head of the Nature Conservancy in Montana. And he also has somewhat of a reputation for being a bit of a renegade, imagining what could be and then going after it. He was able to convince the higher-ups, much to their challenge, but to buy a guest ranch at the foot of one of the drainages there, and one that turns out to have a whole bunch of wetlands, these glacial potholes, wetlands. And it's one of the areas where the grizzlies come out in the springtime and they graze alongside of the cattle. They eat grass. whoever imagined big grizzlies can be eating grass, for God's sakes? But they do occasionally go beyond that. But the Nature Conservancy and others struggled for several years. The ranchers did not like them doing this, could care less. And at some point after about 6 years, a little light bulb went on, and some of the ranchers figured out, well, if I'm going to get paid for a conservation easement on my ranch, in effect get paid for equity that I'm not using, that's not a bad idea. And then if their neighbor who was getting on in years and their kids didn't want to take it over, if they were doing the same thing, they could do a tax-deferred exchange, taking the capital they got from the sale of a conservation easement and trading it into the deeded land of their neighbor that had similarly reduced value because of the easement on that. So now they have a substantially expanded economic base to continue ranching. And they began to, a few, light bulbs more, you did that? Oh, that's how you did it. And then that has grown magnificently. It also was helped by the Fish and Wildlife Service, who came in and, as they do still, work in areas of extensive wetlands. Okay, I'll finish this up. It's a tough one politically because the funds that supported that have come from offshore well drilling. And as part of the agreement that allows those sites to be developed, and the funds that are coming in still from that have been diverted away from this purpose substantially. It's made a huge difference. So I only have 40 slides to go. We can, but that, the waterfowl production areas up there, the snow geese, Greater Yellowstone, the park, and then headwaters that have a lot of conservation easement work done in them, like Upper Paradise Valley. This is what's next to Yellowstone Park. You know they all come out of there. And they are, thank you very much, ranchers, sharing this with your cattle. Bison up there. And this happens to be the Madison Valley, south of Bozeman, southwest. This is the Gates of the Mountains. Have you all experienced the Gates of the Mountains? Taking that boat trip in there? It is fabulous. I've done that several times. I never get tired of it, or of all the stories that go with it. Another organization that has that created a center where they tell those stories. This is sort of the classic, and what next? What can we do to extend this story into new places in successful ways? Consider investing in the book, and there are copies out there on the table that the Traveler's Rest can help you with. Share this story with landowners, support open space bonds, conserve and hope. All those things. It's caring deeply and communicating effectively. And that 80-20 rule has been copied by others. There's a group in the Big Hole that follows that rule. And there are places all over the country that have learned about that. That must mean that I'm done. I'd love to questions. I'm happy to.
Does anybody have a question? Oh, we got lots, okay. First, I'm gonna ask you to repeat the question so the folks on Zoom can hear.
Okay, sure.
I think it was on slide 5 or something, but when you were asking or distinguishing between private and public land conservation, and you said the public one wasn't as effective with conservation, it said on there. What was it about?
So the question is that I had said something about the public lands conservation was not as effective
At conservation.
That's a good catch.
Yeah.
Because there have certainly been a number of effective conservation moves on public lands, and they continue in the form of proposed new wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, with management recommendations within the Forest Service, how to deal with fire, how to harvest in ways that are sustainable, how to do grazing in sustainable ways. That has been extremely effective, and many very bright folks in those agencies have figured those things out and made them part of the formal structure. So in that way, it's been extremely effective. What it has been challenged by, though, and particularly you think of a new wilderness area, think about how long that public debate goes on, for years, and how it winds up being an us versus them between the right and left wing, or whatever, for whatever reason.
It's easy to get to an agreement.
You need to get to an agreement, thank you, and it's harder to reach an agreement. And for me, standing up here to reach agreement with all of you, that's a bit of work. If we were having a cup of coffee, sitting out at the table there and talking over, so I can find out what it is that you want,
Right.
what would help you the most, and then thinking about that and say, well, here's a way I can help make that happen. And if we're both clear about that, we can move ahead and implement it. And the implementation process is so much simpler than dealing with Congress and the president and 20 other organizations that have their own idea of what the best thing is. So that's kind of my point there, is that that's a avenue of communication that is available at this level and that has been put to work effectively over time to produce these outcomes. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, I understand that Representative Ryan Zinke has introduced areas, wilderness areas to be converted into, I'm not quite sure how they're opening, but they're going to change the status.
Mm-hmm.
Where are those areas located, and are you supporting that, or are you not supporting?
The ones that have been most visible have been in Utah for disposal. What I find entertaining by that whole logic is that this is because we need more housing. Wait a minute. Where are these places? What kind of land are they? Why would you want to do that there? It's sort of nonsensical. We've been through this before, 20, 30 years ago, I think. We survived that. And I think this too will pass, but not without a lot of agony. And to a certain extent it could happen, but it would have to be on a much grander scale to really make a difference, frankly. But the idea of just giving up what we all own, I find very difficult to support. Yeah.
I just have a question about the easements themselves.
Yes.
When landowners give them or, work with land trusts to put them into easements, what keeps them in the easement? Because like if the landowner were to pass or sell their land, is
Yes.
that kind of like a nuance with the person that's coming in, or are they able to say, I don't want this anymore? I'm just wondering how that works.
Yeah. The question is, what happens in the transfer of ownership? Whether through, I'm expanding that a little bit in terms of the owner dying and heirs inheriting or selling, whatever, the new owners take it over. How are they impacted? One of the biggest jobs that the land trusts have is they monitor these easements and actually go out and meet with the landowners every year. And so what's working, what's not working? Have you run into some problem with the way the easement is interpreted that is, can we work through that, that kind of thing. The legal effect of the conservation easement, and the more common situation would be as part of a development area with roads and access roads, there may well be a road that goes across your land for the neighbor to get to their land. And that right is established by an easement. It's an active use easement, though, not what's considered a right to prevent use. So that easement, when you go to close with the change of owners, is part of the title report. It runs with the land and is intended to run forever. So that is a major factor, and that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, is that you want to be very thoroughly informed about conservation easements if you're going to be involved with them directly. And of course, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks easements have the benefit of consistent legal advice over time and a lot of experience with conservation easements. So they tend to be a little more standardized in the content. And there is concern, too, that many of those properties, from the department's standpoint, want to have public access since it's public money being spent on the easement. And that tends to make those projects go better if the landowner is willing to go along with that, kind of like with hunters, so many hunters coming in a season, that kind of thing as a solution. But that, whatever the rules are, and there are very specific rules legislatively, and the land trusts are all members of the Land Trust Alliance, a national organization, and they are accredited through a fairly rigorous process to make sure they know what they're doing and are continuing to do it. And should a land trust go out of business, there is a legal procedure of handing those responsibilities off to another willing party, another similarly set up nonprofit tax-exempt organization.
Thank you again so much, Bruce. I think we have to thank Bruce for two things. One, for coming and presenting today, but also for protecting so much of our wild Montana for us to enjoy.
Thank all of us.
Just a quick reminder that we'll be back here next week. Lee Sullivan is going to be talking about Lewis and Clark in art, so that should be a lot of fun for us Lewis and Clark nerds. So please join us for that. And there are copies of the book for sale out in lobby. I bet if you chose Disarm, Bruce would sign it for you. All right, that's great. Thanks again, everybody.